I wanted to start with, I read one of your Substack newsletters, and you said your advice to younger self was it's dangerous to believe everything that you think.
Hmm.
And so I thought about this, and I was like, what sort of level is it dangerous to believe everything you think? Because I think me and Joel have a lot of thoughts, and it's quite hard to navigate which ones to believe in.
Well, yeah, I mean, it can be, I mean, if you're a hateful person and you believe everything you think, obviously it's going to be more dangerous than maybe if you're just a little neurotic. I mean, and danger is a relative position, of course, right? I mean, some things are going to make you more miserable, while some things will make others more miserable. So I suppose, when I was writing this, I was really just thinking about how very often we make ourselves miserable all the time, because we just ruminate on things. We get stuck. And because we subscribe to those ideas, they then kind of possess us almost, right? They become almost a part of our identity. And I think that the danger in that is that when we allow these kinds of thoughts to take hold of us, we miss sometimes what's going on. In fact, when we're in the field doing anthropology, we have to always contest between, or not contest, we always have to kind of walk in the balance between perceived truth, what we think is happening, right, versus ground truth, what is actually happening. And if we stay too much in our heads, if to really try to contemplate things, then we don't see what's actually happening on the ground. And this can lead to all kinds of bad policies or bad data, which can then lead to all kinds of other effects. So it's really relative, right? I mean, if you're ruminating over, some woman that you met at the bar the night before, that's a different kind of rumination and a different kind of level of danger, relatively harmless, except for your own sense of sanity. Versus if you're doing important, field research, and your recommendations could change lives of people, and you subscribe to certain ideas that maybe necessarily aren't true, those kinds of thoughts can be more dangerous, right? So, especially when you fully believe them and fully subscribe to them. And I think we have a tendency to fully subscribe to things based on a number of things, confirmation bias, what feels good, what we're looking for, or anchor bias, which is the first time you've heard something, you tend to be more biased towards the first telling of something, right? And for Americans, that's like a good example would be the Pilgrims and the Indians Thanksgiving kind of thing. And we have like this whole mythos about something that never really happened, at least nothing close to the way that Americans tell it about Thanksgiving, because first Thanksgiving was, much like 2 centuries later during the Civil War. So, yeah, and those kinds of beliefs, the anchoring in those kinds of biases can lead us to create, holidays that are problematic. There's a lot of things. I mean, I could go on and on about examples, but certainly subscribing to your thoughts and emotions in full and not being critical or not simply just watching and being like, what the hell is that thought? Those can lead you down interesting blind alleys.
So is it a solution to change your perception and turn something dangerous into a good light, or is it to kind of see it as it is and remove all the biases?
Well, here's the thing. We can't really remove all of our biases. We can only really be kind of aware of them, right? I mean, we're kind of stuck. And in general, any information we're processing is going to come with all kinds of built-in biases. For example, linguistic bias. So there's certain things I can't think about because I'm a primary English speaker and I only have some Spanish. So there are going to be concepts and ideas that don't flow into English very well. So, I think the best technique, it's a mindfulness practice to sit and really be like, okay, I'm thinking this thing. What implications does that thing have, right? Although that can then lead to over analysis too. So it's, you have to, I think one of the things you have to constantly do is practice empathy, and practice empathy with people who are pretty different than you. And that really helps you to kind of grow. And anthropology is really useful for that, because we don't really we're not seeking to impress our opinion upon others. We don't necessarily agree with what other cultures or people are doing. That's the idea, is not to just be like, well, anything goes. It's more to be like, okay, we're going to put ourselves aside for a second. We're going to do our earnest to really understand what it's like to be this person in this cultural context. And then if we're going to pass judgment, we do it after we feel like we've got a really good, solid understanding. But we try to avoid, we're trying to be scientists, right? So when I'm going out into the field, I kind of think in terms of, well, how can I really understand this person, actively listen to them, and not just in my mind respond to everything they're saying, or my conversation respond. Like, I'm not a fan of, increasingly not a fan of devil's advocate arguments. I think approaching things more Socratically and asking really good questions and really trying to understand why people come to those conclusions can be really good. I say soft Socrates, though, because we don't want to go to the level where they're ready to poison us with hemlock, right? So, but you can do this in a variety of ways. Not just, obviously, if you have the privilege to be able to travel and visit other cultures, that's a great thing. But that doesn't necessarily lead to more open-mindedness. In fact, there was a study of American students who studied abroad, and they found that sometimes they were just as xenophobic as when they left, because they weren't prepared for the cultural differences. So they kind of like went back inside themselves and just didn't let the outside world sort of wash over them. They just kind of retreated in fear, right? Reading books by people from very different cultures and backgrounds can be a really good way of softening believing in your thoughts. Or just having a conversation with someone, maybe an immigrant or another religion, or, just someone who's different, and really trying to keep an open mind, right? Trying to say, okay, well, I don't necessarily have to agree with this, but what thread is it? And I think here's the thing. There's this, some of this neurology that's coming out in the last several years that talks about how when our core beliefs are challenged, it can feel like a physical attack, right? Because it's pushing up against our neurological system, and and we have these neural pathways that develop over the course of a lifetime. And I'm not a neurologist, by the way, so make sure you're going and reading up on this stuff to make sure I'm not totally off base here. But essentially, it can feel threatening to have your core beliefs challenged. But I think if we're going to go out into the world, which is increasingly diverse, and we are increasingly moving around, and, things with climate change is going to make us more diverse, because migration is going to surge at levels that we have not probably known in human history as climate change worsens. We're going to be in a situation where we're dealing with more people. And I think consciously thinking before you have a conversation, if you have this opportunity, and thinking, I'm going to try and really listen and understand. I'm not going to just assume that I'm right. And I'm going to really seek to understand their argument. I think it's a really good tool. And I think that's really what I was trying to tell my younger self, is like, really listen to other people, really try to, even like parental advice, which is not always the best, because there are generational changes, and the technology is so different from when like my parents were a kid, for example, or inequality is worse here in the States. Or, like we can't afford to buy houses anymore, like working a 40-hour week. A lot of the circumstances from past generations is not relevant anymore. So, but still listening to their point of view can be helpful, because there still might be, even if you disagree with everything your parents say, there still might be one or two nuggets of truth in there that are actually helpful, right? And still challenge your ideas. So I think that's really where I was going with. That was a very long way to circle back around.
Yeah, quite a lot of thoughts popped in my head there. I'm. It's kind of like Pearson has an idea of assume the person you're talking to knows something that you don't. But with that study that you talked about, does that mean that when you speak to someone, you should try and adapt yourself onto them, or should you kind of just keep like a filter of this is who I am? I'm going to be the same with everyone. The study where you were talking about is that xenophobia with Americans?
Well, I think it's a phobia with people in general. We tend to like to be right. It feels warm and cuddly and lovely to be right, right? So, I think that's a natural human inclination to want to feel right. And I think, certain kinds of media push narratives, and then algorithmic bias push these kinds of things. Sorry, can you repeat your question one more time?
So should we adapt ourselves onto other people, or should we keep the same version of ourselves towards everyone?
Well, so you mean, should we try to be like a chameleon? Is that what you're asking?
Kind of. It's kind of adapting ourselves to try and be interesting towards maybe their values and what type of person they are.
Well, I think it depends. How much do you want to understand? Because in anthropology, one of our primary research methods is something we call participant observation. The participant observation means that we do as they do, right? So if they have a ritual or a ceremony, we partake. We partake as much as they're willing to allow us to get in there, right? If we have to dance through an entire night around a fire, cool, let's do it, right? Let's try, right? So it depends on how much you're willing to try and understand. And I think, this kind of attempt to radically understand another human requires more than just a conversation. We have to try and live with them, live like them for a day. And that's what anthropology is about. It's also very difficult to do that. And we, even with years experience, have culture shock, where we go in there and we feel stress and anxiety because we're not used to the way that they communicate, or the signs and symbols around us, or the particular values or ideas. And so it can be deeply, deeply uncomfortable. And I've taken students into the field and watched some of them melt down because it's not something that everybody can necessarily do. People think, well, you can study people. That's easy. Anyone could study people. Well, put yourself in an entirely another culture with a completely different set of rules, and you might feel differently, right?
And
what's that?
Are you talking like tribes and stuff that you take your students to?
Yeah. But not even just tribes. Like, when I spent some time over in the UK, specifically in Northern Ireland, and even that was very stressful. A lot of times I couldn't understand necessarily what everyone was talking about because the slang is so different, right? So, you're hearing different slang, different words. Words have different meanings. Words from the United States don't necessarily mean the same thing, and that can be, that changes the way that each of us frame how we move through the world, and that in itself can be stressful. Now, it's far more stressful to do like when I went and backpacked the Nile, and was not able to really speak very much other than a few basic words of Arabic. That's a lot more stressful, right? But you don't have to necessarily go and live with an indigenous culture to experience significant culture shock. If you go live in Shanghai or Tokyo, or someplace anywhere that's significantly different, you'll feel stress. It's part of it.
And unless you use like Google Translate everywhere.
Well, even then, right? Because just the way that you move through the world is going to be different. Mm. Like, I'll give you an example. So I have a friend from Guatemala, and she is very physical, right? So she's in your face. She's standing inches from you every time she talks to you. It almost feels like she wants to kiss you because she's so very much in your bubble. And Americans have a much wider sense of space than Guatemalans. And so, for us, when we're close to somebody, we still keep, several feet away because our personal space is super important to us, right? But she doesn't have that same conception because she grew up in a completely different culture. So, when I'm going into another culture, my sense of space, the tone of my voice can mean different things. How much eye contact I'm supposed to have can mean completely different things. All of these kind of subconscious, nonverbal communication things we do are out the window. The UK and the United States have a lot of similarities because, of course, we were a British colony. So there's a lot of cultural overlap. So it's less stressful for a more similar culture. But even I grew up on the East Coast of the United States, in South Philadelphia. And when I was in middle school, I moved from Philadelphia to Denver, Colorado. For those of you not living in the United States, that's an 1,800-mile move, right? I mean, that's bigger than your whole country. So because we're the third or fourth largest country in the world, I think. So moving, even though we speak English, the communication style was different. So, on the East Coast, to show a sign of showing interest in a conversation is you cut each other off, you interrupt each other. It's very loud. Everything's an argument. Everything is, kind of dry humor all the time. And if you are not used to this kind of dry humor, it can feel insulting and feel demeaning. But it's actually kind of a sign of intimacy a lot of times when you're this way. And and of course you have the famous stereotype of how loud New Yorkers are. Well, people in Philly are not much quieter, right? So I moved out to Colorado, which typically people wait their turn to speak. They don't cut each other off. They're a lot more soft spoken. Debate is not a core part. And so I get out here at age 12 and I couldn't get along with hardly anybody. It took me years to get used to the communication difference as a kid, to trying to figure out how to make friends, because I was very off-putting for a lot of people. So even in regional things, if you go up to Scotland or go down to Ireland, there are going to be different, or Wales, versus London, there's going to be different ways of communicating, different dialect, different slang, and there'll be slight differences. So, and those are things you can get caught up on and not realize it.
I've got a lot of questions for what you said there. It's great. But I think something would be good to sort of ground our whole conversation context for myself and Jake and people listening is could you give us a kind of elevator pitch of what it is you do? And you mentioned the phrase field work quite a few times in that. What does that field work look like for you on a regular basis, or what are some things that you've done recently or in the past?
Yeah, so it depends. It depends on what I'm doing and what population I'm working with, just like anything else. But typically, for example, my graduate research focused on media systems. So what I do is I try to understand, how does media impact culture, right? So really my question, the question of a cultural anthropologist in particular, is always, how do we understand the cultural phenomenon that's happening, right? And you can take many different approaches with it. You can maybe particularly look at kinship and family. You can look at the concept of race. You can look at how gender shapes society, how language does. In my case, I focus more on media. But with anthropology, we also take a holistic approach. So if I'm going to look at media, I still also have to look at race, class, gender, religion, all the other elements of culture, considering how they fit into the media sphere, and then how those ideas then move back out, right? So research for my graduate thesis was, I went and worked with a theater organization, and they're a community-based theater organization in the spirit of a guy by the name of Augusto Boal. And Augusto Boal was 1960s activist in Brazil, fighting against a fascist government, essentially an authoritarian government, and he used plays, not with actors but by community members, to tell stories about what people every day were facing or stories of history, right? So this group has very much, it was called the Theater of the Oppressed. It's still around, this organization, Theater of the Oppressed, but now they charge like a ton of money for people to participate in Theater of the Oppressed, which is really funny because it was very much like a community-free organization in its origins. But I suppose maybe they argue that they have to pay for their nonprofit stuff that they're doing and to make, pay people who are running these workshops and stuff. But the organization I work with is called the Romero Theater Trip. They're having their 20th anniversary this year, so I'm working with them again a little bit. So what I would do is I would go to the rehearsals and hang out there, and I would talk to people and get to know them, and I would try and participate the best I could. In the rehearsals. I wouldn't necessarily get on stage during the final performances because I was also doing a documentary film and filming them. So I really didn't have the opportunity to get up on stage. But in rehearsals, I would act out in the plays and really try to understand the scenes and then talk to people and then do long interviews with them. And then I compared them to a lot of the literature and research on 24-hour news narratives. And how those impact culture. So I looked at, okay, how does a community-based media system compare to 24-hour news media systems, and how do each impact individual lives within a culture, and then how does this reinforce dominant ideologies or not, right? So that was my research. But an anthropologist, especially nowadays, there's more what we call applied anthropologists in the United States. Whereas I think Europe still does a lot more of the classical anthropology, where you go and you work in the field and you hang out with people for a couple of years, and then you do interviews and you get to know their lives and their life stories, and then you kind of report back. There's still American anthropologists who do that, but there's not a whole lot of grant funding for it anymore. A lot of what we're doing now more is, this particular Native American tribe is having issues with water rights. Let's go and learn about what their traditional approach to water land management is, and let's see if we can find ways to integrate that into the U.S. Forest Service or Fish and Wildlife or whatever structure is managing that water system. So another example, when I was a graduate student, I worked with 17 Native American tribes out of Nevada on a 2-year project. And it was a consultation project with the Air Force, the Department of Defense, and these 17 tribes. And it was federal compliance. So, when a federal government is doing anything, and in this case, we're talking about an area where they're doing weapons testing and that kind of stuff, they need to consult the indigenous cultures through a bunch of laws that came out in the 90s. To make sure that their cultural material is being preserved. So we did this 2-year project, and we did a documentary film surrounding this, and we had 5 teams of indigenous filmmakers, and they told their stories about the land, about some of the medicine that they would use that come from the land, and also the story of them being forcibly ethnically cleansed by the same military who was providing this opportunity for consultation 60 years before for atomic testing. So, because this is the area where we did, most of our atomic testing, and I believe 22 countries tested atomic weapons in that area, or something like that. So it wasn't even just the United States, right? So we were looking at what is the indigenous knowledge of the land, and here's an opportunity for them to share and present their information to the government. What the government does with it is a whole other can of worms. Quite frankly, I don't really know what they do with that data, but the goal is to try to get as many indigenous voices into the conversation as possible, so they have an opportunity to have some sort of semblance of agency, especially with a long history of colonialism.
Big. I'm interested in this idea of, I want to pronounce this right, schismogenous, which
Schismogenesis,
yeah.
yes.
So you wrote about how that means creating identities through division and challenging challenging expected behaviors. You sort of said that makes people stronger. So I wanted to ask, why does that make people stronger, and what does that mean for everyone else?
Well, it doesn't necessarily make them stronger. What it does is it solidifies identity, right? So, and this is why, when we think, you may often hear that, every culture has an other, especially if you're going to college, they'll talk about this a lot. Every culture has an other, so we have an enemy. Every culture has an enemy. And we define our identity a lot on what we perceive as negative qualities of the enemy, right? So a classic example would be America versus Russia during the Cold War, right? So, and in America, what you see is this kind of solidification of Christian identity in the 1950s because the godless communists were the enemies. And so you saw all kinds of things begin to happen. Suddenly, we were required to sing the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning in elementary school, and they added "under God" to that Pledge of Allegiance, right? We also see in our on our coinage, "In God We Trust." And so you start to see like these additions of re-emphasizing the Christianity of the American people versus these atheist, godless communists, right? So, but you see this all over the place. You see this with like food taboos, right? Oh, I don't want to eat the culture of I don't want to eat the food of the oppressor. That's one of several very possible reasons that you have a pork taboo in Judaism. And things. Here's another important thing that you learn when you're an anthropologist. Very few things are what we call monocausal. They're not driven necessarily by one cause, right? So and this is very tough for people because people like simple explanations. But the reality is the world is so much more messy than our brains like to recognize. But so schismogenesis, and this is why it can be really hard to talk politics with someone who is deeply invested with politics and their identity, because what they're doing is, so here in the United States, conservatives versus liberals, and there's slurs for each. Like we just fling slurs at each other all day long. And then, the more we kind of make two-dimensional cartoonish characters of the other side, the more we solidify our certainty that we are right, and thus, form our whole cultural identity around these politics. And so when you're going to have a conversation with someone, no facts are going to work. Facts are really because it doesn't matter, because what you're fighting against is identity and not information, right? And so it can be very hard to have these conversations, because if you try to argue with them and just throw facts at them, and regardless of which side you're on, that's not going to progress the conversation, because their identity is formed around opposition. Their identity is formed around, let's say they're an anti-vaxxer. It's formed around the idea of being an anti-vaxxer. So know how much information you give them about vaccines, that's not going to change the conversation. That's just going to solidify their worldview. And this is makes for really difficult, complex conversations about really important things all the time, because we like to mythologize. And that's what a lot of conspiracy theory and stuff is. It's mythologizing. It's how can we overly simplify something rather than look at complex systems? Oh, it's these couple of guys over there that are causing all the problem, right? The evil crime family or whatever. But rather than looking at the 300 years that it took to get to this particular situation and the hundreds of different causes for this thing to have manifested, which is what social scientists do, but does not easily translate to the general public. So.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. It kind of aligns with the key social psychology theories that you probably know about, like the social identity theory and self-categorization theory, where basically people will establish an in-group and an out-group, and they derive a lot of their self-esteem through promoting the in-group and hating the out-group. And we have this this innate inclination towards tribalism. And I see it myself as I'm an athlete, and it's where I think about other teams and other competitors, and just generally, I think as a young man at 19 years old, we have these kind of drives inside of us, and it's quite interesting to observe that in yourself and in the wider culture. But I wanted to ask you, do you think that being the case, right, that it's a natural thing for people to establish in groups and out groups, and it's a lot of the time everything kind of goes towards us versus them. Can a culture be created without division, like in a harmonious way? Because if you look at history, I struggle to see where that goes well. And if you do think it's possible, like, how do we do that? Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, and we do have moments in history where, there's always bias. We're never going to erase bias. We're never going to completely abolish concepts of otherness and tribalism, but we can certainly put a big check on them. And there are periods in history, and you see these massive leaps in innovation and science and technology where, in just art and all kinds of things, where you have much more cosmopolitan mixed societies. And it's not just, of course, you have the European Renaissance as a great example. But, at the height of the Mongol Empire, you see this. The first secular religious debate was in the Mongol Empire. There are spaces and times when it's possible to have a series of people who are different come and have discussions. But one of the factors that makes that possible is periods of prosperity, right? So they tend to happen at the centers of empires or the center of centers at well-resourced cultures, right? So when you're not having to worry about putting food on the table and you're not having to work 2 or 3 jobs, you have a lot more brain space and opportunity to think critically about others. And it also requires you to be exposed to lots of viewpoints too, right? Which we are on the internet if we don't have the algorithmic systems. So before algorithms really became a mainstay of social media, you had a lot more exposure to diverse opinions, right? But now it turns out that, Facebook makes its most money, for example, by creating or promoting content that outrages people. And it's the same is true with 24-hour news cycles. The purpose is to outrage people because that's how they keep you watching, because people are addicted to their anger. So we have all these media systems that do nothing but foster outrage, right? And it's not like there's not plenty to be outraged about. The world is a very complicated mess right now. And a lot of us, the world itself is going through a massive transition after the pandemic. It's going to take us decades to really know what that looks like. But that pandemic, whether we like it or not, changed us fundamentally forever, as pandemics always do. The Black Death brought us things like the Renaissance. It collapsed the Mongol Empire and made a power vacuum possible for European colonial project to rise, right? The 1918 pandemic, that changed the world's politics. Although that one so entrenched with the First World War, it's hard to know which is the First World War and which is the pandemic, because they were happening simultaneously. But like the reason, for example, we think tanning is sexy, because the 1918 pandemic promoted something that was already kind of existing in the fringes, but really became popular during the pandemic, which is the sunlight movement. The idea that getting out into the sun was a core part of health, right? And so the sunlight movement was like, you can cure most illnesses by getting out into the sun and getting fresh air. And so what we had before the pandemic was, the kind of the pale Victorian approach where, a sign of health is not being able to work and being very, light-skinned for Europeans. And then afterwards, tanning was a sign that you had the ability to get outside, that you weren't just always working in a factory. And so now you have the leisure class was tanning, right? So, and that's all weirdly mixed up in the 1918 pandemic kind of stuff. So we don't know how much the 2020 pandemic is really going to change us. And then on top of that, we have climate change going on, right? So we're going through a lot of major world changes. So the opportunity to have like these spaces, these collaborative spaces where we're exchanging cultural ideas are relatively rare right now. I know me, I teach at multiple schools trying to put together a paycheck, because they don't pay college professors hardly anything unless you're one of the prestigious tenure track schools. So, all of us are 70% of American faculty has to have multiple jobs. So, it's not, and that's the norm though in the United States. Many Americans have multiple jobs. So how can you have, so how, having these complex discourses requires that you have enough time and energy to have them. Otherwise, you just kind of retreat into what you know and what's familiar, and anything that becomes a challenge becomes aggravating to you. So to have these kinds of spaces where we develop societies of, where the otherness is softened, right? Because again, I don't believe we're ever going to get rid of it entirely. But where the otherness is softened, it requires kind of a lack of scarcity. And much of capitalism is intentionally created scarcity. So as long as we lived under this kind of intentionally created scarcity to drive this economic system, we're not going to get to this space that we need to be as humans to really kind of get our heads in a better spot.
Hey, that's interesting. So do you think it's possible then, that was sort of my question, to have a culture where otherness is completely softened? So you're saying, sorry, hold on. You said that the reason that, based on what I gather from that, was the reason that there's a lot of otherness is because the sort of economic system that we live under creates that division because there is inequality. So do you think that that is one of the biggest proponents leading to this sort of like tribalism that we see? And like, I'm basically asking, why do you think we live in like a culture, especially in the West, where there is that divisiveness? Because surely it makes sense to not have that in place. And what do you think it's people that are higher up in that economic system wanting to maintain that power and not wanting that sort of inequality to decrease for their own sort of benefit?
Yeah, it's largely because we are so hyper-focused on the cult of the individual. The idea that everything is about the individual, that the individual must strive from birth to become a great person, that it's individuals alone who change history. We don't really have this sense of relation to one each other. And now that's really stark in America, right? We don't really have, in the United States in particular, we are hyper individualist, right? But you think of like the myth of the rugged individual cowboy going into the frontier and conquering the world and making something of himself, right? That's a huge part of American culture. But the reality is like, we're not really individuals at all. And, the way our brain functions makes us feel like we are, but we're not. Because think about what you're born into. How much of your culture is something you did versus something that was given to you, right? So like history, all of history, you're born into it. There's no way out, right? Like you're just born into this situation and you're born right in the middle of this big mess, right? So that alone, and all the values of your culture, you don't create your own language. You don't create the concepts and symbols. When, if you spend a lot of times with a group of friends, you find you start to talk just like those friends, that you begin to share more interest, right? Because over time, you kind of, there is a part of us that is an individual, that is unique, that is different. But most of us is taken from other places, or, pushed on us through peer pressure, or, or if you're born into a religion, there's a whole series of values and ideas that you're raised with that become a core part of your cognitive programming. So there's very little of us that's actually an individual. And every time you encounter a new person, a little bit of that person kind of impresses on you. Now, if they're an enemy, then it will solidify your beliefs. If they become a friend, it will change your beliefs. And this process is going on every day, constantly for you. And, depending on how big or little the event you experience can change your identity pretty significantly. So we're not static individuals. So we, as long as we continue to worship the individual and pretend as like this is a thing, we're going to feel lonely. We're going to be disconnected. We're not going to recognize that organizing together is in our best interest. Versus, in a lot of the power structures, the whole goal is divide and conquer the poor. The entire concept of race in American history was created to divide and conquer the poor, because the wealthy classes were not able to get them to stop organizing. So if you can get people to hate each other for the color of their skin, you can control them much easier. If you can divide and conquer, the concept of heterosexuality, for example, was created largely during the 20th century. And it was used as a way of dividing the middle class from the poor so that those two didn't, again, unite and go against the upper classes. So a lot of these concepts and symbols we use are essentially class warfare, divide and conquer techniques, forget community and focus on the individual.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, and because I agree with you that being like the experience of being an individual, I think, is largely a psychological defense mechanism from the things that you've just outlined about the fact that you're born into a world you didn't choose, into a culture you didn't choose, the history you didn't choose, and a lot of the things that you do aren't really in your control. And I do agree with you that it is quite dangerous to have such a restrictful, like, individualist view of the world, right? And that this idea of the American dream and there's this like zero-sum game that we're all playing is not good in a lot of ways, because people will be to the detriment of that. But then I have a question, and that is, how do we sort of realize that danger of individualism but still have a sense of agency in our own life? Because that's something I find quite difficult in myself, is like, I understand that my sense that I am separate from everyone else is not really a great thing and isn't really true if we look at it objectively. But for me to kind of feel like I have control over my life and the world, I have to feel that I can do something about it and that I am a person that can make change. And I think it's quite hard. And I wonder if you agree with me that it'd be great if we could do that in culture and have everyone agree to this like idea that we're not all individuals and that we are this big one human consciousness, or whatever you want to go, however, what spiritual rabbit hole you want to go down. But I think to do that, everyone has to agree to play the game. And I don't know if that's like, is that possible? Because there are, like, the human mind is so caught up in greed and wanting more than other people, and this competition and this tribalism, that do you think there's a way that there will ever be a chance where the people in power begin to play the same games that people who are switched on to these dangers sort of aware of,
Well, you got to make them.
But how do we do that?
At least.
Like, is it revolution? Like, what's the plan?
Yeah, so I mean, if you guys really want to understand how powerful collective action and communities are, like, the history of the United States is a great place to start, actually, because we start out where essentially the only people who really have any power are the landed elites, right? Only the landed elites can vote. And, many of those landed elites have an immense amount of slaves. Women they're also basically cattle. They have no rights, no property. They're passed around as if they have no agency whatsoever, right? And what you see is that, and if you read particularly books like A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, what it will show you is that all of the history of the United States has been one of protest and struggle, right? And you see what happens when we organize things. Well, when you organize things, you get more rights. You get more. You can ultimately free your slaves, right? You can have movements where those former slaves are then given rights, and of course there's backlash, and that systemic racism is not over in the United States. It's an ongoing problem for us. But there's constantly people who are fighting for this stuff. You have to be invested in your community. That's the reality of it. You have to be invested in your local communities. You have to participate. You have to care about your neighbors. But, we have so much distraction now, right? I mean, we're not, people keep talking about, are we in 1984? What's going on, right? Mass surveillance everywhere. But we're actually like a mix of dystopias, right? We're like in 1984, which focuses on surveillance as the primary control mechanism. And then we're also in Brave New World, where pleasure and distraction are the key focus of the totalitarian society. And then, of course, there's also gender stuff going on. So we're also in The Handmaid's Tale. So it's at least here in the United States, it's where they just removed Roe versus Wade, which is just absolutely insane, right? Like, so we have all of these systems, and we get people fighting against each other, but we can you have to be able to talk to people who are different than you. That's the key to understanding how to organize, how to work together, how to have a better tomorrow. You got to work with people who are different than you. And one of the dangerous silos, and I see it really hard with my leftist and liberal friends, is that they completely discount every conservative point. There's nothing possible conservatives could ever offer anybody. And as long as you're taking that approach and you're solidifying that sense of individuality, individual identity, and there's that schismogenesis again. If you're using that, you can't make change. But there are many examples throughout history where, cultures lived relatively peacefully. That no culture in history is perfect. There's always conflict and war. I think, and the reason for studying history is so that we can be better, and we have the tools and opportunities to be better. And I think the goal should be. This is what I think the goal should be. How do we best actualize human potential? That's where I want to get to. Because one of the problems of history is that so much of human potential was lost to inequality, to slavery, to discrimination, because we were so focused on, greed and wealth and poverty. And we only focus on those things when we are, when we're struggling with our own sense of self. You're not greedy. You don't want more if you're satisfied in life, right? And so there's lots of, there's so many pieces to this conversation. So many, each avenue of identity has its own struggles, its own characteristics. And, when I teach courses on cultural diversity, we go through all of them over the course of 16 weeks. But even then, we're just scratching the surface, right? Because these issues are complex. And I think the way that we make a better world is to try and understand difference, to try to not just understand it, but leverage it. Like, the different kinds of skills and abilities each person has is a tool for society. I don't know everything about being a plumber or, a mathematician, or, I know culture and humans, but there's many areas that I don't understand or know where other people's knowledge is going to be useful to me. And I think, this idea or this impulse that you want everything to be the same around you because it's easier is such a bad impulse, because discomfort is a sign of growth very often, right? Not always. There could be plenty of situations that are uncomfortable that are not about growth, that are just about being uncomfortable. But I think we have to really work with our communities and the people who are as close to us as possible, physically even, and get away from. And the virtual spaces are good. Virtual spaces have a lot of benefit, and our technology can create things like more intimacy with friends, but it also can, silo us into specific kinds of beliefs. When you go out and you work in a community organization, your beliefs become secondary to the community, because you get to know people and you soften to them and you think, well, I don't agree with everything Bob over here says, but I know he's a really sincere and caring person. And so you help each other out. And as a result, you both become more moderate to each other's ideas. It doesn't mean you necessarily agree with the ideas, but because you are working with a person, you see them as another human being, it gives you the opportunity to say, well, he's arrived at these ideas somehow. How do I understand how he's arrived at these ideas? And when you can start asking questions of how did someone else arrive at their thoughts, at their thinking, then you can start to really play with your own thinking too, and build connections in places where connections wouldn't happen. And you can realize, despite our differences, there are enough commonalities for us to work together. And we have to learn to work together. We got to get along to some degree. We can't just hate each other all the time. That's no way to function as a species or even as a community.
For me, individuality is really important, and I've built that kind of in the way that you said, with being open-minded to talking to loads of different people, but it's also through originality. And I think it's so hard to be original because everyone, like, it's already been done, it's already been said. But I think you maybe build that originality by talking to those people that you disagree with, and that's why it's important. Yeah, I want to feel like an individual. Like, I feel like it's kind of important for fulfillment. Um, you want to feel like you were here and you were different. And that your time here isn't just kind of a construct from everything around you. But how do you think people can become more of an individual?
So, yeah, I mean, obviously, everyone isn't. This is not to say that individuals don't exist, right? We certainly do. But what you said is a very Western idea. The idea, it's very much one life culture, right? So if you believe that you live only one lifetime and you are born and you die and you must achieve as much as possible during that lifetime to feel fulfilled, that's very Western, very Western. There are lots of cultures out there that believe in things like reincarnation. It's like, well, I'm doing this again. So, if I sit and stare up at the sky for 80 years, that's okay because there's another lifetime, right? And so, this idea of what we value is very culturally specific, and what you value for being an individual. And that's not wrong necessarily, but it's not right either, because there are other ways of approaching this idea of life, like purpose and fulfillment are very Western constructs. But just, and you can see even through artists, if you talk to a lot of very creative individuals, they'll have various perspectives on the nature of individuality. But a lot of Eastern philosophy is very much like, well, you did this before, you'll do it again. Like, you can achieve all you want, but achievements are meaningless. And peace and liberation in life are the most important thing, right? So, and that's the kind of the core tenet of things like Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism in a lot of ways. And so, you have some different very worldviews that are approaching this question quite differently. But it's important to you. That does not negate that it's important to you. Okay, so I just want to emphasize, like, the fundamental goals of your life are not necessarily better and worse than someone else's. And how do you be another individual? Like, if you want to be original, like, expose yourself to as many ideas as possible, and you'll be a greater amalgamation of various sources of knowledge. And I think that's a way to be original. That gets really complicated, though, if you're, because then you can get into the whole conversation about cultural appropriation too. Like, if you're taking ownership of other cultures' sacred stuff, that can also create really individual, really interesting dynamics and power. And it's a very complicated thing to be an individual.
I mean, yeah, if I take the idea of reincarnation, I mean, I get it with, like, or I might be able to achieve those things like the next time around. But I'm not sure, like, where I stand with it. But is that so that people in the East value peace more than fulfillment then?
Well, it's a stereotype, right? Because everyone in every culture can negate everything the cultural system says, right? So I can be a part of a Western culture like the United States, and I can hate everything about the United States, or I can love everything about the United States, or I can be like most people, somewhere in the middle, where I like a lot of things about my culture and I dislike a lot of things about my culture, right?
I suppose some individuality could come with ego, and that would be the opposite of peace, kind of.
Yeah, although, and there's a little bit of a misunderstanding about a lot of Eastern philosophy in terms of the ego. The ego is not something you can get rid of. The ego is that's your individuality. That's you, right? But the question is whether or not it possesses you, right? This gets back to the very first question you guys ask about believing what you think, right? So, if you subscribe so much to I am the center of everything and I am always right, then the ego becomes a problem, right? But the ego is just like, how do I move through this world? It's the series of causes and conditions that made me who I am. It's not necessarily your enemy. It's just you don't want it to be like a slave driver, essentially. You want it to be, relatively flexible. You don't want to become rigid in your thinking, I think is the ideal in Eastern philosophy. Is like, and I'm a practicing Buddhist, and I've met a few lamas who have meditated for 40, 50 years of their lives, and they're still individuals. They're still people. They are more open and flexible in a way that a lot of people are not, right? But they still have emotions. They still get angry. They still get sad. It's not like there's some mystical like being who transcends all of reality. They're still very much a part of life, but life does not bother them as much, if that makes sense, right? And that's a lot of the focus of someone who is spiritually focused on Eastern philosophy, is like, how do I get to a point where life doesn't bother me as much and I can suck out as much joy from life as possible, right? Versus like how we view that in a lot of the Western world is how can I make achievements, because achievements is how I'm going to get to this sense of fulfillment, right? And the problem with that is, in anyone who has accomplished a number of things, like I've published books, I've done TED Talk, I feel like I've accomplished a fair bit in my life, but that doesn't necessarily feel fulfilling. Like, you finish the thing and you're like, okay, now what? What's the next thing, right? There's always a next thing, and I think that's the key lesson of Eastern philosophy is there's always a next thing. So if you're always chasing goals and fulfillment, and that's all you chase, then you're not going to find fulfillment. You're not going to find happiness. You've got to learn to savor things, right? That's the idea. Savor moments, because those moments, even if you live 1,000 lifetimes, you're here at this particular moment with this particular kind of configuration, and that's worth having, right? That, even a miserable moment is worth having because you have the opportunity to be alive and aware of it. That's the Eastern approach to things.
What do you think of the kind of contrast that's like the thought that the individual is the center of the world? You are the world, you are the center of the galaxy, versus the idea that we're all one.
Yeah, and I think scientifically, it's impossible to deny that we all have a relationship. I'm not really necessarily a subscriber in like a universal consciousness or anything like that. I think a lot of those ideas, again, are very Western focused and very Western centric. From Jung and people like Joseph Campbell and various others who really tried to universalize things. I think it's dangerous to universalize the human experience because, if you're a member of the Inuit and you live in Nunavut in northern Canada in the Arctic Circle, your life experience is going to be radically different than if you live like with the Kayapo in the middle of the Amazon along the Xingu River, right? You're going to have very different life experiences, and thus your mythology and your values and your ideas about the world are going to be very different. And I think it's there's this impulse in the 1960s to say all culture is universal, all language has universal grammar, all religions are really just the same thing trying to get at the same place. But I think that's a lazy argument. It's rather than looking at the richness of the human experience, we just want to say, oh, everybody's the same and it's all okay, right? And the impulse comes from dealing with things like racism and sexism and saying like, oh, we shouldn't judge each other because we're all ultimately the same. That's a great impulse, but then that also is just like window dressing. Like it's not real. Like, but that doesn't mean that different ideas and different cultures and different experiences, they all have validity. Like, whether I'm talking about the Western approaches to the world, and this focus on achievements, like that has validity too. Like there's a lot of really good things in Western culture. There's a lot of really good things in Eastern culture. And there's like way more than just Western and Eastern culture too. Like we're still stuck in this kind of Oriental model of West versus East that we have been really since the Crusades. But the world is like, when you say West, what countries are you talking about? How do you classify them? When do you put them in the West? Like, at what point do they become Westernized? Is Westernized just a kind of sense of hierarchy? Do we consider West better than East? Are we still So, but the reality is there's 8 billion people on this planet, and we all have unique experiences and unique knowledge, and those things are worth sharing. It's worth sharing with each other. We're more diverse now than we have ever been in history. We're evolving faster than we have ever evolved in history, on a physical level. Because we have more mixing, more genetic diversity than ever before. We're changing fundamentally as a species. We're going to look very different in 100 years time, just like we looked very different from, 1924 to 2024. The world is going to be a very different place, and we have a lot of opportunity to work with our communities and leverage our knowledge in positive ways to create a much more vibrant, maybe even a post-scarcity world in 100 years. I'm an optimist. I think we are headed in a good direction. I think we have a lot of really big problems, but I think that leveraging knowledges from different communities and learning to work together I think it's happening. I just think it's hard to see in spaces like social media, because I do see lots of organizations on the ground working together to address a lot of problems and try to bring people together.
Joel, what's your thoughts on the argument of being at the center of the universe versus World One?
I think it's the difference between maybe what's true objectively and how it feels to be a person, because you feel like you're separate, and you are the center of the universe for you. Right? That doesn't mean you're the center of the universe, but you are the center of yours, right? And that's something that's quite,
can't be anything else.
That's it, and that's why it's something quite difficult to sort of contend with. But I do agree with everything you're saying. That actually, I think there's a lot of growth to be found in experiencing other people's universes and like seeing things from their other perspective. And there's a lot of joy and insight and growth to be found there.
I like to say we're story machines, right? This is all we are. The way we model the whole universe is a story machine. We're trying to explain everything, right? And so, like, we have a choice. Do we want to tell a better story or not? That's the choice. What story do we want to tell about ourselves, our lives, and what we did with it? That's the question, right? And so there's my Western achievement thing. I think I strive to tell a better story. That's what my goal is, right? Go ahead.
And I think I agree with you. I think a lot of our mental health actually lies on the story that we tell ourselves about who we are and how the world works. And it's like maybe one of the biggest choices that you make. And I think also if you don't choose it consciously, it kind of gets chosen for you, especially like you were talking about the narratives that we're sort of fed by social media. And like, if you are a passive consumer of the narratives that most people are seeing and observing on a daily basis, you can actually have your whole narrative and your universe that you're the center of skewed quite massively, which can be quite a dangerous thing. So, I think this is an important topic for people to think about, definitely.
Yeah. And I think, when we work together with communities, we're telling collective stories, right? We're not just telling a story about, now, from our point of view, it's always a story about us, as you say. You can't be otherwise. You can't. Our brains are set up to categorize and separate and divide things and understand them, and it has been a very wildly successful strategy for the human experience, right? Because our ability to discern and discriminate and examine and explore, we have, books like back on my shelf here. We have a whole arenas of knowledge that have been coalesced into volumes that we can pass on for generations and generations. And that's how we get this massive change of technology, right? I mean, everything that we have as a species is because the way that we are structured, and we can't escape that. So let's use it. Let's use it for the benefit of each other, right? And tell better stories. And that's also, a little bit of a plug here, but it's why I wrote the book on how to use anthropology and social science to build more authentic fictional worlds. And when me and my co-author wrote that, our idea was, how can we get people to tell more authentic stories? How can we get them to really engage with the concepts of the human experience? And whether or not people use it successfully or not is up to them, or how much or how little they use it is up to them. But we wanted to at least give people an opportunity to think, oh, here's how cultural systems work. Here, maybe it can help me tell a better story. And because the fiction stories we tell matter to how we perceive reality. I mean, I relate to the world based on fictional characters all the time. I can't help it. Like, I think, oh, well, this character did that in the fiction, and then that makes me think of this experience. Because we also do that with people we know. Our brains can't tell the difference between fictional characters and like the people we meet necessarily. Once it's in a memory, once it's in a story, it's just another part of our makeup. It's why when you tell really painfully bad stories that are, maybe horribly bigoted or something, those get in your brain too, right? So like, we're just telling stories all the time. That's what memory is. It's just an ongoing conversation about the story of our life.
It's because that those stories that have been passed down and been retold and retold, it's like they're hyper real. It's like you see them everywhere.
Yeah. And I don't know if you guys have read this, but the Stephen Fry trilogy on the Greek mythology, I highly recommend actually doing the audiobook, because Stephen Fry is just freaking brilliant. Yeah. But reading those, like, you're, oh my God, I didn't realize how deeply invested in Greek culture Western culture is. I mean, a lot of our concepts are very much still Greek concepts, because the mythology has remained so steadfast across to Western culture, and so much of biblical Christian culture is deeply Greek. Like, a lot of the concepts and ideas are not from the Bible, they're from the Greek world, and then they were taken, and because if you think about it, the first biblical texts were largely written in ancient Greek, so of course a lot of the concepts and ideas of Christianity are deeply Greek ideas.
What? I wanted to end on the importance of being in a community. What's your thoughts on cults? Are they inherently bad? Is it like kind of like normally like always a power abusement, or is there some good to be found?
Well, I think by definition a cult is usually bad, but cult is an interesting word, because every religion has cult. It's just veneration of an object, a leader, or place, or something, right? It's a veneration of a noun, essentially. So if you are a Christian, part of your cult is the worship of Jesus, right? So and Christians were very much accused of being cult worshippers in their first days, right? I think they were known as incestuous, cannibalistic baby eaters, because the early days of Christianity, they all called each other brother and sister. So they didn't, the outsiders could be like, wow, they're having sex with their brothers and sisters, right? And then they talk about eating the body and blood of Christ, but because they wanted Jesus to be non-threatening, they show him as a baby. So from an outsider perspective, like the ancient Romans were like, they're eating babies, like, it's like, and they're having incestuous sex. Look at these heathens, right? So, but like, there are legitimately like really dangerous organizations out there that seek to exploit their members. Netflix did a really good episode of its short form documentary series Explained on cults, and you can actually watch the episode for free on YouTube, and I highly recommend it. They did a very good job at taking the social science in like 25 minutes and really showing you how cults function and why. And it really does come down to like a charismatic leader wanting to exploit the hell out of people. And, it's people fall in love with their legend, right? And even some of these individuals probably believed what they were selling in the beginning, at least. But over time, or maybe they'd still believe it all the way to their death. Maybe they really believe they're like, the manifestation of Jesus in this particular generation. Like, I think David Koresh of Waco fame, I think he really believed that. And I think it was his Seventh-day Adventist upbringing, which was originally a cult in itself, that said the world is coming in 7 days and Jesus will appear. I think because of his upbringing, he came to believe in his own legend. And then, of course, once you have that kind of power, once you have the sense that you are divine, then you can do nothing wrong, then that leads you to all kinds of avenues of corruption, right? So cults are hard. It's hard to discern what's a cult, but really, there's a lot of criteria, but can you leave without significant harassment? Can you have they exploited your wealth and resources, or maybe your sexuality? Like, is exploitation going on, right? But, the problem with that, too, is every system of power has exploitation on some people. So it's a complex definition.
Well, Joe, unless you've got anything else, I think this is we can end it here.
Yeah, I think that was quite insightful. So thank you for giving us your time and having a conversation with us today.
But where should people go to view your to find out more about you?
Yeah, so my two areas are my Substack, and my Substack is, you can either find me under Michael Kilman, or LiridiansLaboratory.com is my website. If you go to my website, you'll basically find pretty much everything I do of significance gets posted there in one shape or form. But yeah, if you like my work and stuff, certainly sign up for my Substack and you can get a newsletter. There's a free version, which is like 90% of the stuff, but then I release some stuff that's just only for people who, pay $5 a month or whatever to try and make some of that artist a living. So, but yeah, I'm pretty easy to find if you just Google me. I'm all over the place.
I appreciate your time, Michael. It was nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you both as well.
See you later.